I never thought I'd be standing here, looking back at how my life unfolded over the last 10 years. I remember the first time I met Andrew like it was yesterday, even though a decade has passed since that warm summer afternoon. It was at a coffee shop, one of those small, cozy places tucked away on a quiet street in Brooklyn. I had just moved to the city for a job, fresh out of college, wide-eyed and filled with hope. Andrew was sitting at the counter, sipping what looked like his second cup of coffee, reading a newspaper, a sight that seemed so rare, even then. His dark, wavy hair fell slightly over his forehead, and when he looked up and caught my gaze, he smiled. That smile, it was the kind that made you feel seen, like you mattered, even if you were just another stranger passing by. I felt a strange pull, something magnetic. I ordered my latte, and before I knew it, we struck up a conversation about books, movies, life. Things that seemed superficial at first but soon became the foundation of everything that followed. It didn't take long before we were inseparable. Andrew was kind, attentive, and full of ambition. He made me feel like the only woman in the world. We spent weekends exploring the city, finding new restaurants, attending art exhibits, and sometimes just staying in, lost in each other's company. It was easy, effortless, and I believed, without a doubt, that I had found the love of my life. After 2 years of dating, he proposed. It wasn't some grand, elaborate gesture, but it was perfect for us. We were in Central Park, sitting by the lake, watching the boats pass. He pulled out a small velvet box and asked me to spend the rest of my life with him. Tears welled up in my eyes as I said yes without hesitation. I didn't need any convincing. I was certain that Andrew was the man I wanted to build a life with. We married in a small ceremony surrounded by family and close friends. The day was perfect, just as I had imagined. We danced, laughed, and promised to love each other for the rest of our lives. For a while, everything seemed like a dream come true. But then, as life often does, reality started to creep in. The early days of our marriage were blissful, but as time passed, the routine settled in. Andrew's work became more demanding, and mine was no different. Long hours at the office, deadlines, and the stress of everyday life began to chip away at the magic we once had. We still loved each other deeply, but something had shifted. The spark wasn't gone, but it was dimmer. We tried to keep the romance alive, date nights, weekends away, but it never quite felt the same. The conversations grew shorter, and the silences longer. I told myself it was normal, that all couples go through these phases, and I believed that things would go back to the way they were. Then came Ethan. It was at a conference in Chicago, a work trip that I didn't think much of at the time. I was part of a panel discussion on marketing trends, and Ethan was one of the guest speakers. He was charismatic, confident, and charming in a way that made people gravitate toward him. During the panel, I noticed him glance in my direction a few times, but I didn't think much of it. After all, I was married, and Ethan was just another colleague. After the panel ended, there was a networking event, and that's when Ethan approached me. We exchanged the usual pleasantries, but the conversation quickly shifted from work to more personal topics. He was funny, witty, and had a way of making me feel important. There was something about the way he looked at me, like he saw me in a way that Andrew hadn't in a long time. It was intoxicating, and I found myself laughing more than I had in months. We spent the rest of the evening talking, and when the event ended, he offered to walk me back to my hotel. It was a short walk, but every step felt charged with a tension I hadn't felt in years. I kept reminding myself that I was married, that this was just harmless conversation, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was an undeniable attraction between us, one that I hadn't felt since those early days with Andrew. When we reached the hotel, Ethan lingered for a moment, his eyes searching mine. He didn't say anything, but the air between us was thick with unspoken words. My heart raced, and for a fleeting second, I considered what it would be like to kiss him, to give in to the temptation that was pulling me toward him. But I couldn't. I was married. I had made vows. I said goodnight and walked into the hotel, my heart pounding in my chest. As I rode the elevator up to my room, I felt a mix of emotions: guilt, excitement, confusion. I loved Andrew, didn't I? So why did Ethan make me feel this way? Why was I craving something that wasn't mine to have? That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the evening in my head. I hadn't done anything wrong, but it felt like I had. Ethan was a temptation, a distraction from the life I had built with Andrew, but he was also a reminder of something I hadn't felt in a long time: desire. Real, raw desire. The next day, I avoided Ethan as much as possible, keeping our interactions strictly professional. I didn't trust myself around him, and I didn't want to risk crossing a line I couldn't uncross. But as the days went on, I found myself thinking about him more and more. I would catch myself daydreaming about what it would be like to be with him, to feel that spark again. It scared me how easily those thoughts crept into my mind. When I returned home from the conference, Andrew greeted me with his usual warmth, asking about my trip and how the panel had gone. I smiled and told him it was fine, that everything went smoothly, but inside I felt different. I felt like I was hiding something, even though I hadn't acted on anything. The mere fact that I had considered it, that I had been tempted, was enough to make me question everything. That was the moment I realized how fragile my marriage had become. The days that followed my return from the conference were unsettling. Andrew didn't notice anything unusual. He was the same loving husband, coming home tired after long workdays, collapsing on the couch beside me to watch TV or share a quiet dinner. But in the quiet of our home, my mind wasn't with him. It was still lingering in Chicago, in that fleeting moment with Ethan. I told myself it was just a fantasy, something to shake up the monotony of married life, but the more I tried to forget, the stronger the memory became. It wasn't that Andrew had done anything wrong. We had simply fallen into the kind of comfortable routine that all couples do after a few years. But that comfort, once so soothing, now felt like a cage. I missed the excitement, the rush of something new, the flutter in my chest when I anticipated a touch or a glance that could mean more. Ethan had awakened something in me, something I had buried in the stability of marriage. Desire, yes, but also curiosity. Who was I beyond this role of wife? Did I still have the power to attract someone, to ignite that kind of spark in someone else? I didn't want to admit it, but a part of me enjoyed the idea that someone like Ethan could look at me and see more than just a married woman. Weeks passed, and though I tried to refocus on my life with Andrew, the distance between us grew. We still loved each other, of that I was sure, but the easy laughter, the spontaneous kisses, and even the conversations about our future felt less frequent, almost mechanical. The connection we once had felt fragile now, like a delicate thread that could snap at any moment if stretched too far. One evening, as Andrew sat across from me at the dinner table, engrossed in his phone, I realized how alone I felt, even in his presence. I wanted to talk to him, to tell him what was going on inside my head. But how could I? How could I confess that I had been tempted by someone else, that I wasn't sure if I was as happy as I had convinced myself I was? The truth would hurt him, and I couldn't bear the thought of being the reason for his pain. So I stayed silent. But the silence was deafening. A few days later, my phone buzzed with an unexpected message. It was Ethan. "Hey, just wanted to say it was great meeting you at the conference. If you're ever in town again, let me know. Maybe we can grab coffee." My heart skipped a beat. I stared at the screen, the message taunting me. It was innocent enough, right? Just a casual invitation. But deep down, I knew it wasn't as simple as it seemed. I could feel the temptation pulling at me again. Stronger this time because now it wasn't just a memory. It was real, tangible, and right there on my phone. I didn't reply right away. I let the message sit, like a ticking time bomb, knowing that responding could open a door I wasn't sure I'd be able to close. For hours, I wrestled with myself, weighing the consequences, imagining what could happen if I replied. It was just coffee, I told myself. What harm could there be in that? But I knew better. By the time Andrew came home that evening, I had convinced myself not to reply. I deleted the message and told myself that was the end of it. I was committed to my marriage, to my husband, and I wasn't going to jeopardize that for a fleeting attraction. But even as I deleted the message, I couldn't shake the feeling of loss, like I had just let go of something exciting, something that made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. The next few weeks were filled with tension. Andrew noticed I was more distant, but he didn't press me on it. He probably thought I was stressed from work or tired, and I let him believe that. In truth, I was consumed by thoughts of Ethan. I replayed our conversations over and over in my mind, imagining what might have happened if I had kissed him that night, if I had let myself fall into temptation. Then, one Friday afternoon, while sitting at my desk at work, another message from Ethan appeared on my phone. This time, it wasn't a simple invitation. "I haven't stopped thinking about you. I know you're married, and I don't want to make things complicated, but I felt something that night." "Did you?" My heart raced as I read his words. There it was, the confession I hadn't allowed myself to make. He felt it too. That undeniable connection, that pull. I stared at the message, my mind reeling. What was I supposed to say? Ignore him? Tell him it was a mistake? Or admit what I had been feeling all along? That I was just as tempted as he was? I didn't respond right away. Instead, I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside me. But the truth was, I didn't want to calm it. I wanted to feel that rush again, that excitement that had been missing from my life for so long. For the first time in years, someone had seen me, really seen me, and I couldn't deny how much I craved that. That evening, after Andrew had gone to bed, I sat on the couch, my phone in hand, staring at Ethan's message. The house was quiet, and the only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, and all I had to do was take one step to fall into the unknown. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I could still turn back, still choose the safe, familiar life I had with Andrew. But deep down, I knew that if I didn't respond, I would always wonder what might have been. And so, with a trembling hand, I typed out a reply. I felt it too. I hit send. The moment the message was sent, a wave of guilt crashed over me. I felt sick, like I had just crossed a line I couldn't uncross. But at the same time, there was a thrill, a sense of excitement that I hadn't felt in years. My phone buzzed almost immediately with Ethan's reply. "Let's meet, just to talk. No pressure. I need to see you again." I sat there, staring at the message, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew that meeting him could change everything, that I was playing with fire. But the temptation was too strong to resist. I typed out a response before I could change my mind. "Okay, let's meet." I sat back, the reality of what I had just done sinking in. I had agreed to meet him. This was no longer just a fantasy or a fleeting attraction. It was real, and I had set it in motion. I wasn't sure what would happen when we met, but one thing was clear. I was standing at the edge of something dangerous, and I wasn't sure if I could pull back. The day we planned to meet felt like a blur. I went through the motions at work, pretending everything was normal, but my mind was elsewhere. I told Andrew I had a late meeting that evening, which wasn't entirely a lie. I did have a meeting, just not the kind he imagined. As I drove to the bar where Ethan and I had agreed to meet, my hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. Doubts swirled in my mind. Was I really doing this? Was I about to risk everything I had built with Andrew for a man I barely knew? But another part of me, the part that craved something more, silenced those doubts. When I arrived, Ethan was already there, sitting at a table in the back, away from the crowd. He looked up when I walked in, his eyes locking onto mine. That same electricity from before was there, stronger now that we were face to face again. I felt my stomach flutter as I walked toward him, my heart pounding with anticipation. "Hi," I said, my voice shaky, betraying the calm I was trying to project. "Hi," he replied, standing up to greet me. His smile was warm, and for a moment, everything else faded away. We sat down, and for the first few minutes we made small talk, dancing around the real reason we were there. But eventually the tension broke. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about you," he admitted, his voice low, as if confessing a secret. I looked down at my drink, my fingers tracing the rim of the glass. "I haven't either," I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop them. There it was, the truth laid bare between us. We both knew what was happening, what this meeting really was. The attraction was undeniable, and now that we were sitting here, facing it head-on, it felt impossible to resist. "I don't want to make things complicated for you," he said, his hand reaching across the table, brushing lightly against mine. The touch sent a jolt of electricity through me, and I had to fight the urge to pull my hand away, and yet, I didn't. Instead, I let the moment linger. "It's already complicated," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We sat there, staring at each other, the weight of what we were about to do hanging in the air between us. The tension in the air was palpable, like the calm before a storm. We both knew what was happening, yet neither of us had the courage to say it out loud. Ethan's fingers brushed against mine again, more deliberately this time, and I felt my resolve crumbling. For the briefest moment, I let myself wonder what it would be like to give in, to let go of the guilt and responsibility and just feel something for the first time in what seemed like years. Ethan's voice was low, almost hesitant, as he asked, "Are you sure you want to be here?" I looked up at him, meeting his gaze. His eyes were filled with the same confusion I felt, part desire, part doubt. "I don't know," I admitted honestly. "But I'm here, aren't I?" He leaned back slightly, his hands still resting on the table, so close to mine. "You don't have to stay. I get it if this is too much." Too much. The words echoed in my mind. Was it too much? Was I really prepared for the consequences of whatever this was about to become? I thought about Andrew, about the life we had built together, the comfortable, stable life that was suddenly feeling more like a burden than a blessing. How did I get here? How had it come to this, where sitting across from a man I barely knew felt like the most thrilling thing in the world? "I'm not sure what I'm doing," I whispered, more to myself than to Ethan. He didn't push. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to stir up all the emotions I had been burying for months, maybe even years. We sat in silence for a few moments, the noise of the bar around us fading into the background. It felt like we were in a bubble, suspended in time, where nothing existed but the two of us and the decision that loomed between us. "I didn't come here expecting anything," he said after a while. I felt something with you that night, and I wanted to see if it was real." I nodded, my throat tight. I felt it too. The admission hung in the air between us, like a confession I hadn't wanted to make, but couldn't hold back anymore. "But I'm married, Ethan." "I know," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not trying to mess up your life, but it doesn't change the fact that there's something between us. Something I haven't felt in a long time." His words hit me hard because they echoed exactly what I had been feeling. There was something between us, something undeniable, something I couldn't ignore. I had spent so long trying to be the perfect wife, to maintain the facade of a happy marriage, that I hadn't realized how much of myself I had lost in the process. Being here with Ethan, I felt seen again, wanted, desired in a way I hadn't been in so long. But was that enough to risk everything? The silence stretched on, and I could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on me. I had a choice. I could walk away now, go back to my life with Andrew, and pretend none of this had ever happened. Or I could take a step into the unknown, into something that might be fleeting, but was also thrilling, intoxicating, and real in a way that scared me. "I can't do this," I said suddenly, my voice breaking the tension. "I shouldn't be here." Ethan's face fell, but he nodded slowly, understanding. "I get it." I stood up, feeling the rush of guilt flood over me. I needed to leave before I did something I couldn't take back. But as I reached for my purse, Ethan caught my hand, stopping me. His touch was gentle, not demanding, but it sent a wave of electricity through me that made my heart race. "Wait," he said softly. "I don't want to pressure you, but before you go, just be honest with yourself. Do you really want to leave?" I stared down at him, my heart pounding in my chest. Did I? Everything in my rational mind was screaming at me to walk away, to go back to Andrew, to forget that this night had ever happened. But another part of me, the part that had been yearning for something more, something different, wanted to stay, wanted to see where this could go, even if it meant walking down a path I knew I shouldn't. "I don't know," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Ethan stood up then, still holding my hand, his eyes searching mine. He didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes. There was no turning back now. The moment stretched on, and I could feel the pull between us growing stronger, drawing me closer to him. Before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us and kissed him. The world around us disappeared. All I could feel was the warmth of his lips, the rush of adrenaline coursing through my veins, and the overwhelming sense of rightness in that moment. It was as if everything I had been suppressing for so long had finally broken free, and I was powerless to stop it. When we finally pulled apart, both of us breathless, I realized what I had done. There was no going back now. "I'm sorry," I murmured, stepping away from him, my mind racing. "I shouldn't have." "Don't apologize," Ethan said softly, his hand still resting on my arm. I wanted that too, but the reality of what had just happened was starting to sink in. I had crossed a line, one that I couldn't uncross. Guilt washed over me in waves, but beneath it all was a lingering thrill, the undeniable rush of having done something forbidden. "I need to go," I said quickly, pulling away from him. "I can't do this." Ethan didn't stop me this time. He just watched as I grabbed my purse and hurried out of the bar, my heart pounding in my chest. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped outside, but it did little to calm the storm raging inside me. I had kissed him. I had crossed the line I promised myself I wouldn't. And now I had to live with the consequences. That night, as I drove home, my mind was a chaotic swirl of emotions. I couldn't believe what I had done. I had kissed Ethan. I had cheated on Andrew, even if it was just a kiss. The guilt gnawed at me, making it hard to breathe. What kind of person was I? How could I look Andrew in the eye after what I had just done? When I got home, Andrew was already asleep, his breathing slow and steady as he lay sprawled across the bed. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him, my heart heavy with guilt. He didn't deserve this. He didn't deserve a wife who was sneaking around, kissing another man while he worked so hard to provide for us. I felt sick to my stomach. I slipped into bed beside him, careful not to wake him, and stared up at the ceiling, my mind racing. I had to end it with Ethan. I had to cut off all contact with him before things got even more complicated. But as much as I knew what I should do, part of me didn't want to. Part of me wanted to feel that rush again, that excitement that had been missing from my life for so long. For the next few days, I avoided Ethan's texts, telling myself that I needed to distance myself from him. But the more I tried to push him away, the more I found myself thinking about him. The kiss had awakened something in me that I couldn't ignore, and no matter how much I tried to suppress it, the desire to see him again lingered just beneath the surface. Andrew noticed the change in me, though he didn't say anything. He was used to my mood swings, chalking them up to stress from work. But I could feel the distance growing between us, and every time he kissed me or held me, the guilt weighed heavier on my heart. Then, one evening, while Andrew was out with friends, my phone buzzed with a message from Ethan. "I can't stop thinking about you. Can we talk? Just talk." I stared at the message, my heart racing. I knew what I should do. Delete it, ignore him, move on. But instead, I found myself typing a reply. "Okay, let's meet." This time I knew what I was getting into. This time I wasn't just meeting him to talk. We met at the same bar, but this time there was no hesitation. When I walked in, Ethan stood up, his eyes locking onto mine, and without a word, we both knew why we were there. He didn't ask me if I was sure. He didn't need to. We both knew that we had crossed a line, and there was no going back. This time there was no small talk, no dancing around the issue. We sat close, our knees brushing against each other under the table, the tension between us thick and undeniable. "I can't stop thinking about you," he admitted quietly, his hand resting on my knee. The touch sent a jolt of electricity through me, and I had to fight the urge to lean into him, to let go of everything and just feel. "I know," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I can't either." His hand moved up my thigh, slowly, deliberately, and I felt a surge of desire that I hadn't felt in years. It was wrong, and I knew it, but in that moment I didn't care. All I wanted was to feel alive again, to feel something more than the dull routine of my everyday life. We didn't make it to his place that night. Instead, we found ourselves in the alley behind the bar, hidden in the shadows, our bodies pressed together in a heated embrace. The kiss we shared was more intense than the first, filled with a desperation that neither of us could control. His hands roamed my body, and I let him, wanting him in a way that scared me. For those few stolen moments, I forgot about everything, about Andrew, about the guilt, about the consequences. All that mattered was the way Ethan made me feel, the way he touched me like I was the only woman in the world. When it was over, I pulled away, breathless, my heart pounding in my chest. Reality came crashing down around me, and I realized what I had just done. I had cheated, truly cheated this time, and there was no way to undo it. I should go, I whispered, my voice shaky. Ethan didn't stop me. He just nodded, his expression unreadable, and I turned and walked away, my heart heavy with guilt and regret. As I walked away from Ethan that night, my heart was pounding, my mind racing with everything I had just done. The guilt hit me like a tidal wave, overwhelming me with the weight of my choices. I had crossed a line that I couldn't uncross, and now I had to face the consequences. I made my way back to the car, barely noticing the world around me. My hands trembled as I fumbled for the keys, and when I finally got inside, I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing. What had I done? The thrill, the desire, it had all seemed so intoxicating in the moment. But now, sitting alone in the car, the reality of my actions crashed down on me. I cheated. The word echoed in my mind, over and over, each time sharper than the last. I had betrayed Andrew, the man I had promised to love and honor. And for what? A fleeting moment of passion with a man I barely knew? I couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe that I had allowed myself to fall so far. The memory of Ethan's touch was still fresh on my skin, and yet it now felt like a stain, something I couldn't scrub off no matter how hard I tried. I drove home in a daze, my thoughts a chaotic swirl of emotions. Guilt, shame, regret. Every mile I put between myself and Ethan only made it worse, as if I was trying to outrun my own conscience but failing miserably. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I felt sick to my stomach. Andrew's car was parked out front. He was home. The sight of it only deepened the pit in my chest, twisting the guilt like a knife. I sat in the car for a few minutes, staring at the house, trying to muster the courage to go inside, to face him. How could I look him in the eye after what I had just done? How could I pretend that everything was normal, that I wasn't a completely different person from the one he thought I was? Eventually, I couldn't sit there any longer. I had to go inside. I had to face the reality I had created for myself. My legs felt heavy as I walked up the steps, and when I opened the door, the familiar smell of home washed over me. A reminder of everything I had risked, everything I had thrown away in a moment of weakness. Andrew was in the living room, sitting on the couch with his laptop on his lap, probably working on something for his job. When he heard the door open, he looked up and smiled at me. That same warm, loving smile that had always made me feel safe. "Hey, babe," he said, his voice soft and affectionate. "How was your meeting?" My heart twisted painfully in my chest. I forced a smile, hoping he wouldn't see through it. "It was fine," I lied, my voice barely above a whisper. I could feel his eyes on me as I moved toward the kitchen, but I couldn't meet his gaze. If I did, I knew I would break. The guilt was suffocating, but I couldn't let him see it. I couldn't let him know what I had done. So I kept my head down, pretending to be busy, pretending that everything was fine, even though inside, I was falling apart. "I'm just going to head to bed," I said, my voice strained. "It's been a long day." Andrew didn't question it. He nodded, closing his laptop and standing up. "I'll be up in a bit, just finishing a few things here." I nodded quickly and slipped away, heading to the bedroom. The second I closed the door behind me, I collapsed onto the bed, burying my face in my hands as tears began to spill out. I felt like a monster. I had lied to him, betrayed him, and now I had to live with that. The guilt was unbearable, and I didn't know how I was going to face another day with this secret hanging over me. For hours, I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every moment with Ethan over and over again. The excitement, the thrill. It had all felt so intoxicating in the moment, but now it felt hollow, empty. What had I been thinking? How could I have let myself get swept up in something so reckless, so destructive? Andrew came to bed a little while later, slipping in beside me, his arm draping over my waist like it always did. His touch, once so comforting, now felt suffocating. I closed my eyes, willing myself not to cry, but the tears kept coming, silent and steady, soaking into the pillow beneath me. He didn't notice. He fell asleep quickly, his breathing steady and deep. I, on the other hand, lay awake for hours, the weight of my guilt pressing down on me, crushing me. I had never felt more alone in my life. The days that followed were a blur of guilt and anxiety. Every time I looked at Andrew, the weight of my betrayal felt heavier, like a secret I was carrying on my back, dragging me down. I tried to focus on work, on the routine of everyday life, but Ethan was always there in the back of my mind, a constant reminder of the line I had crossed. He texted me a few times after that night, each message short but filled with the same longing that had pulled me to him in the first place. I wanted to respond, wanted to see him again, but the guilt was too much. I couldn't let myself get pulled back into that whirlwind of desire. I had to stop before things spiraled even further out of control. But it wasn't that simple. One afternoon, as I was sitting at my desk at work, my phone buzzed with another message from Ethan. "I miss you. Can we talk? I need to see you." I stared at the message, my heart pounding in my chest. Part of me wanted to delete it, to block his number and put an end to this once and for all. But another part of me, the part that had been drawn to him in the first place, couldn't let go. I missed him too. As wrong as it was, I missed the way he made me feel, alive, desired, seen. Against my better judgment, I typed out a response. "I don't know if we should." He replied almost immediately. "I just want to talk. Nothing more. Please." I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the screen. I knew that if I agreed to meet him again, it wouldn't just be to talk. We had crossed that line once already, and there was no going back. But even as the guilt gnawed at me, the temptation was too strong to resist. "Okay," I replied, my heart racing as I hit send. "Let's meet." We met at a small cafe on the other side of town, far enough away from home that I didn't have to worry about running into anyone I knew. Ethan was already there when I arrived, sitting at a table by the window, his eyes lighting up when he saw me. "Hey," he said softly as I sat down across from him. "Hey," I replied, my voice shaky. For a few moments, we sat in awkward silence, neither of us knowing what to say. The weight of what we had done hung heavy between us, and I could feel the tension building again, the same pull that had drawn me to him in the first place. "I've missed you," he said finally, his eyes locking onto mine. "I've missed you too," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "But we can't keep doing this." He leaned forward, his hand reaching across the table to brush against mine. "I know it's complicated, but I can't stop thinking about you. I don't want to lose this." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. I knew that seeing him again was a mistake, that I was only digging myself deeper into a hole I couldn't climb out of. But the way he looked at me, the way his touch made my skin tingle, was too intoxicating to resist. "I don't know what to do," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I love my husband, Ethan. But you." He squeezed my hand gently. "I'm not asking you to leave him. I just want to be with you, even if it's just for a little while." His words sent a thrill through me, even as my heart ached with guilt. How could I be torn between two men like this? How could I want something that was so wrong? Before I could respond, Ethan stood up and walked around the table, pulling me to my feet. He didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. I didn't resist as he led me out of the cafe and into the quiet alley behind it, the same place where we had shared our first kiss. The moment we were alone, he kissed me again, harder this time, as if he couldn't hold back anymore. I melted into him, letting go of everything. My guilt, my shame, my fear. For those few moments, nothing else mattered but the way his hands felt on my skin, the way his lips moved against mine. The affair with Ethan didn't end that day. In fact, it only intensified. We began meeting in secret, stealing moments together whenever we could. Lunch breaks, late-night rendezvous, hurried phone calls that left me breathless. Every time I saw him, the guilt gnawed at me, but the pull was too strong to resist. At home, I became an expert at hiding my secrets. I would kiss Andrew goodnight, all the while thinking about Ethan, replaying our stolen moments in my mind. Andrew noticed the change in me, how distracted I had become, how distant I seemed, but he didn't push. He trusted me. He believed in us, and that made the guilt so much worse. I was living two lives, torn between the safety of my marriage and the thrill of my affair. And no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I knew that I was spiraling out of control. The worst part was that I wasn't sure if I wanted to stop. I didn't recognize myself anymore. The woman who had once been so certain of what she wanted, of who she was, had disappeared. In her place was someone constantly torn between two worlds, one of stability and love, and the other of secrecy, passion, and danger. Every day felt like walking on the edge of a cliff, one wrong step threatening to send everything crashing down. At home, I did my best to keep up appearances. Andrew was still the caring, attentive husband he'd always been, but I could sense his growing concern. He didn't say anything outright, but I saw it in the way he watched me, in the way he sometimes paused before speaking, as if unsure of how to approach whatever was bothering him. And why wouldn't he be? I was pulling away from him, physically and emotionally, and he was starting to notice. The worst part was that I couldn't even tell him why. I couldn't explain the distance, the late nights, the sudden change in my behavior without exposing the truth, without admitting that I had become someone he wouldn't recognize, someone he couldn't trust. It wasn't just the physical betrayal with Ethan that haunted me. It was the lies, the deception, the fact that every time I kissed Andrew or told him I loved him, there was a part of me that was thinking about another man. I felt trapped in a web of my own making, every thread pulling me deeper into a situation I couldn't control. But the more tangled things became, the more I found myself seeking out Ethan. He was my escape, my secret thrill, the one thing that made me feel alive in a life that had started to feel suffocating. The more time I spent with him, the more I craved those moments, even though I knew they were slowly destroying me. We fell into a rhythm of stolen moments. We would meet at odd hours, in secluded places where no one knew us. Sometimes it was a hotel room booked under a false name. Other times it was his apartment, a place where the outside world couldn't reach us. There, in the quiet intimacy of his space, it was easy to forget about everything else. When I was with him, I could pretend that the complications of my life didn't exist, that I wasn't married, that I wasn't betraying the man who had done nothing but love me. Ethan was intoxicating. The way he looked at me, touched me, made me feel wanted in a way I hadn't in years. It was impossible to resist. He had become my addiction, something I couldn't get enough of, even though I knew I was spiraling out of control. But as time went on, the lines between my two lives blurred. The more I saw Ethan, the harder it became to keep the facade intact at home. I started making mistakes, small ones at first, but they added up. I would come home late, smelling of his cologne. I would forget details of stories I had told Andrew, slipping up in the lies I had constructed to cover my tracks. Andrew began asking more questions, his concern growing into suspicion. One night, after I returned home unusually late, I found Andrew waiting for me in the kitchen. The house was dark except for the soft glow of the overhead light, casting shadows across his face. He was sitting at the table, his hands folded in front of him, and when I walked in, he looked up with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between worry and hurt. "Where were you?" he asked, his voice calm but tense. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Work ran late," I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I had a meeting I couldn't get out of." Andrew stared at me for a moment, his eyes searching mine. "You've been working late a lot lately," he said slowly, his tone cautious. Is everything okay? I forced a smile, hoping it didn't look as strained as it felt. Of course. Just busy, you know? He didn't respond right away. Instead, he stood up and walked over to me, his hands gently resting on my shoulders. You seem different, he said softly, his eyes filled with concern. Distant. I don't know if it's work or something else. But I miss you. I miss us. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I could feel the guilt rising in my throat, choking me. He was right, I had been distant. I had been pulling away from him, and it wasn't because of work. It was because of Ethan, because of the affair that was slowly unraveling the fabric of our marriage. I'm sorry, I whispered, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. I don't mean to be. I've been stressed. Andrew pulled me into a hug, his arms wrapping around me in that familiar way that used to make me feel so safe. But now all I felt was guilt. Guilt for what I was doing to him, guilt for the lies I was telling, guilt for the fact that I was holding on to him while thinking about another man. It's okay, he murmured into my hair. We'll get through it. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that we could somehow find our way back to each other, that I could fix the damage I had caused without losing everything. But deep down, I wasn't sure if that was possible anymore. Too much had happened. I had gone too far. The next few weeks were a blur of conflicting emotions. I continued seeing Ethan, unable to fully break away from him despite the mounting guilt and the growing tension at home. Every time I tried to cut things off, he would pull me back in with a simple text or a phone call, and I found myself unable to resist. I was living a double life, balancing on a razor's edge, knowing that at any moment, everything could come crashing down. And then it did. It was a Wednesday afternoon when my world finally fell apart. I was at work, sitting in a meeting, when my phone buzzed with a message. I glanced down, expecting it to be a reminder or some other innocuous notification. But when I saw Ethan's name flash across the screen, my heart skipped a beat. I can't do this anymore. I want more than just stolen moments. I want you, all of you. I stared at the message, my mind racing. He had never said anything like this before. We had always kept things compartmentalized, knowing that what we had could never be more than it was. But now Ethan was pushing for more, for something I wasn't sure I could give him. My hands trembled as I typed out a response. Ethan, you know we can't. I'm married. His reply came almost instantly. I know, but I can't keep pretending that doesn't matter. I love you. The words hit me like a freight train. Love. He loved me? This wasn't supposed to happen. I hadn't expected things to go this far, hadn't expected him to develop feelings that deep. I had been selfish, thinking I could have both worlds without consequence. But now the cracks were starting to show. I didn't respond to his message. Instead, I spent the rest of the day in a haze, barely able to focus on anything. Ethan's words echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to unravel. That evening, when I got home, the house was quiet. Andrew was sitting in the living room, his expression unreadable. He didn't greet me with his usual smile, didn't ask me how my day had been. Instead, he stood up slowly, his eyes dark with something I couldn't quite place. We need to talk, he said, his voice tight. My heart sank. I knew that tone. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. What's going on? I asked, my voice shaking. Andrew took a deep breath, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. I found something, he said quietly, pulling his phone from his pocket. On your laptop. My blood ran cold. He handed me the phone, and I stared down at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. It was an email. From Ethan. My mind raced, trying to remember if I had left anything incriminating on my laptop, but it was too late. Andrew had found it. I didn't want to believe it, Andrew said, his voice breaking. But I couldn't ignore it anymore. You've been lying to me. Tears welled up in my eyes as I realized what had happened. I had been careless. I had left something behind, something that had exposed the truth. And now Andrew knew. I'm sorry, I whispered, my voice shaking. I didn't mean for this to happen. Andrew's face twisted with pain, his eyes filled with hurt and betrayal. Didn't mean for what to happen? For you to cheat on me? For you to lie to me every day while you were seeing someone else? His words cut through me like a knife. I had hurt him in the worst way possible, and there was no excuse for it. No justification. I had betrayed the man who had given me everything, and now I was paying the price. I don't even know who you are anymore, Andrew said, his voice raw with emotion. I thought we had something real. I thought we were building a life together. But you've been living a lie. I couldn't speak. The weight of my guilt was too heavy, crushing me from the inside out. I had never seen Andrew like this. So broken, so devastated. And it was all because of me. I'm done, he said finally, his voice cold and distant. I can't do this anymore. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Andrew, please. No, he interrupted, his voice firm. It's over. I want a divorce. The room spun around me as the reality of his words sank in. He was leaving me. I had destroyed everything. Our marriage, our life together. And now I was losing him. Andrew turned and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there, alone, in the wreckage of the life I had once known. The weeks that followed were a blur of heartache and regret. Andrew moved out, leaving me in the house that now felt unbearably empty. I had begged him to reconsider, to give me another chance, but his mind was made up. The betrayal had been too much for him to forgive, and I couldn't blame him. I had thrown away everything for a man I barely knew, and now I had nothing. Ethan reached out to me a few times after that, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. The affair, once so thrilling and intoxicating, now felt tainted. Every time I thought of him, all I could see was the destruction I had caused, the life I had shattered. I couldn't face him, couldn't continue down that path any longer. Eventually, I cut off all contact with him. I needed to figure out who I was without him, without Andrew. I needed to face the consequences of my actions and try to rebuild my life from the ashes. But it wasn't easy. The guilt lingered, a constant reminder of the choices I had made. I spent countless nights alone, replaying every moment in my mind, wondering how I had let things spiral so far out of control. I had been selfish, reckless, and now I was paying the price. The divorce was finalized a few months later. Andrew didn't want to drag it out. He just wanted it to be over, to move on with his life without me in it. The finality of it hit me hard. I had lost him, and there was no going back. In the end, I was left with nothing but the memories of what had been, both the good and the bad. I had loved Andrew, but I had let that love slip through my fingers. I had chosen excitement over stability, passion over loyalty, and now I was alone. The affair with Ethan had burned bright, but like all fires, it had eventually consumed everything in its path. And now all that was left were the ashes. Months passed, and slowly, I began to pick up the pieces of my life. It wasn't easy. Every day was a struggle to move forward, to let go of the past. The guilt never fully went away, but I learned to live with it, to accept that I had made mistakes and that I couldn't change what had happened. I found a new job in a different city, hoping that a change of scenery would help me start fresh. It wasn't a cure-all, but it was a step in the right direction. I focused on myself, on rebuilding my life one small piece at a time. I never heard from Ethan again. After I cut off contact, he seemed to accept that it was over. Part of me wondered what would have happened if I had chosen him, if I had let myself fall fully into that relationship. But in the end, I knew it wouldn't have lasted. It had been built on lies, on deception, and something that fragile couldn't stand the test of time. As for Andrew, I never saw him again either. He moved on just like he had said he would. I heard through mutual friends that he was doing well, that he had met someone new. The thought stung, but I was happy for him. He deserved someone better than me, someone who wouldn't betray him the way I had. Took a long time, but eventually I forgave myself. I realized that I wasn't defined by my mistakes, that I could still build a future for myself, even if it wasn't the one I had originally envisioned. I had lost a lot, but I had also gained something important, a deeper understanding of who I was and what I needed to be happy. In the end, The affair with Ethan had taught me a hard lesson about love, about trust, and about the choices we make. It had shown me how easy it was to lose sight of what really matters, and how difficult it is to rebuild after everything falls apart. But most of all, it had shown me that life goes on, even after the worst mistakes. It's strange how life keeps moving, even when you feel stuck in the wreckage of your past. After the divorce, I had to learn to navigate a world without Andrew. The life we'd built together had collapsed, leaving me with fragments of who I used to be and an overwhelming sense of emptiness. But as the months turned into a year, I began to realize that I had a choice. I could either continue to let the guilt and regret define me, or I could pick up those fragments and try to rebuild something new, something better. In my new city, I started over in every sense of the word. The new job kept me busy, and although it didn't fill the void completely, it gave me a sense of purpose. I threw myself into work, into trying to make a fresh start, and in many ways it helped. The anonymity of being in a place where no one knew my past was liberating. I could be anyone I wanted to be here, free from the whispers and pitying glances of those who had known me as Andrew's wife. But no matter how hard I tried to push it all behind me, there were still nights when the weight of everything I had done came rushing back. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the choices I had made, the betrayal, the lies, the hurt I had caused. Those were the hardest moments, the ones where I wondered if I was capable of real love, if I even deserved it after everything that had happened. Andrew had moved on. I knew that much from mutual friends. He had met someone new not long after the divorce, a woman named Claire. I hadn't seen her, but from what I heard, she was kind, intelligent, and everything that I hadn't been in the end. Knowing that he had found happiness again should have brought me some peace, but instead, it only reminded me of how much I had lost. And Ethan, I hadn't heard from him since I cut off contact. After everything had imploded, I knew I couldn't keep him in my life. Whatever we'd had wasn't built to last, and deep down, I had always known that. But there were still times when I missed him, missed the way he had made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. I wondered if he ever thought about me, if he regretted the way things had ended. But I never reached out. That chapter was over, and I knew that reopening it would only lead to more pain. Still, despite the loneliness, I found small moments of peace in my new life. I took long walks in the city, exploring parts of town I'd never seen before. I started taking care of myself in ways I hadn't during the affair or even during my marriage, going to the gym, eating better, and finding hobbies that made me feel like me again. I took up painting, something I hadn't done since college, and found solace in the quiet hours spent with a brush in hand, letting my mind drift away from everything. As the seasons changed, so did I. Slowly, the sharp edges of my guilt began to dull. I couldn't change the past, but I could control the future. And in that future, I wanted to be better, not just for the people I might meet, but for myself. I had been so focused on seeking validation from others, first from Andrew, then from Ethan, that I had lost sight of who I was and what I wanted out of life. It was around this time, nearly a year after the divorce, that I met Lucas. I wasn't looking for a relationship when I met Lucas. In fact, I had convinced myself that I wasn't ready, that I needed more time to heal, to figure out who I was before I could open myself up to anyone else. But life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. It happened on a Saturday afternoon. I was at an art supply store, browsing through canvases and paints, when I felt someone standing next to me. I glanced over and saw a man about my age, with warm brown eyes and a shy smile, holding a sketchbook in his hands. "Sorry, I didn't mean to intrude," he said, noticing me looking. "I'm just trying to figure out if I should try acrylics or stick with pencil." I laughed softly, surprised by how disarming he was. Acrylics can be tricky, but they're fun once you get the hang of it. He smiled, his eyes lighting up. "Good to know. I'm Lucas, by the way." "Rachel," I replied, returning his smile. "Nice to meet you." What started as a casual conversation about art supplies quickly turned into something more. We spent the next half hour wandering the aisles of the store, talking about everything from our favorite artists to the challenges of creative block. There was something easy about Lucas, something that made me feel comfortable in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. He wasn't trying to impress me, wasn't pushing for anything more than just a genuine conversation. It was refreshing. Before we left, he asked if I wanted to grab coffee sometime, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I said yes. I didn't overthink it, didn't let the fears or doubts creep in. I just let myself say yes, and for once, it felt like the right thing to do. Our first date was simple, coffee at a small cafe near my apartment. We talked for hours, and by the time we left, I realized that I hadn't felt this kind of connection in a long time. Lucas wasn't flashy or overly confident like Ethan had been, but he was kind, genuine, and, most importantly, patient. He didn't pry into my past, didn't push me to share more than I was ready to. He seemed to understand that I was still figuring things out, and he was okay with that. Over the next few weeks, we saw more of each other. We went to art galleries, took long walks through the park, and spent quiet evenings talking about everything and nothing. It wasn't a whirlwind romance like the one I'd had with Ethan, but that was exactly what I needed. With Lucas, there was no drama, no intense highs and lows. There was just a steady, comforting presence that made me feel safe. But even as things with Lucas progressed, I couldn't shake the fear that I wasn't ready for this. I had been so reckless in the past, so driven by impulse and desire, that I was terrified of making the same mistakes again. I didn't want to hurt him the way I had hurt Andrew. I didn't want to repeat the cycle. One evening, as we sat together on my couch, Lucas must have sensed my unease. "You don't have to rush into anything you're not ready for," he said softly, his hand resting on mine. "I'm not going anywhere." His words were simple, but they hit me hard. In that moment, I realized that I had spent so long punishing myself for the past that I hadn't allowed myself to believe that I could be happy again. Lucas wasn't asking for perfection. He wasn't asking me to be someone I wasn't. He was just asking for honesty, for the chance to get to know me for who I was, scars and all. So I told him the truth. I told him about Andrew, about the affair with Ethan, about the guilt that had weighed on me ever since. I told him about how I had lost myself in the choices I'd made, and how I was still trying to find my way back. Lucas listened quietly, never interrupting, never judging. When I finished, I braced myself for the worst, for him to pull away, to tell me that he didn't want to be with someone as damaged as I was. But instead, he reached for my hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. "We've all made mistakes," he said softly. "But those mistakes don't define you. What matters is what you do now, and from what I can see, you're trying to be better. That's all anyone can ask." I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, a sense of relief I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, I realized that maybe I didn't have to carry the burden of my past alone. Maybe there was a way forward, a way to heal without erasing everything that had come before. With Lucas, I found something I hadn't expected: a second chance. A chance to rebuild not just my life but myself. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments when the guilt would resurface, when I would wonder if I truly deserved this kind of happiness. But Lucas was patient, and he never let me fall too far into those doubts. As the months passed, our relationship grew stronger, built on a foundation of trust and honesty. I didn't hide from him. I didn't lie. And in return, he gave me the space to heal, to become the person I had been before everything fell apart. A year after I met Lucas, I found myself standing in front of a blank canvas in my apartment, brush in hand. The sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over the room, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. The chaos of the past was still there, but it didn't define me anymore. It was part of my story, yes, but it wasn't the whole story. I dipped the brush into the paint and began to work, letting the colors blend and swirl on the canvas. As I painted, I thought about how far I had come, from the woman who had lost herself in an affair, to the woman who had found her way back to something real, something lasting. Lucas had helped me see that I wasn't beyond redemption, that I wasn't doomed to repeat my mistakes. And while I still carried the lessons of my past with me, I no longer let them control my future. The painting began to take shape, a vibrant blend of colors that seemed to reflect the journey I had been on. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And for the first time, that felt like enough. Life had given me a second chance, and this time I wasn't going to waste it. Years later, I can look back on that time in my life with a sense of clarity. The affair with Ethan, the collapse of my marriage to Andrew. It had all been a painful, destructive chapter. But it had also been a turning point, a moment that forced me to confront who I was and what I truly wanted. I learned that love isn't about the grand gestures or the passionate highs. It's about the quiet, steady presence of someone who sees you for who you are, who accepts your flaws and helps you become better. That's what I found with Lucas. A love that didn't demand perfection, but rather offered understanding and grace. Andrew and I never reconnected, and that was okay. He found happiness with someone else, and I was genuinely glad for him. I no longer felt the need to seek his forgiveness, because I had found peace within myself. I had learned to forgive myself, and in the end, that was the most important thing. As for Ethan, he remained a distant memory, a reminder of a time when I had let myself be consumed by something fleeting. I didn't regret the lessons I had learned from that affair, but I no longer felt the need to hold on to the past. It was over, and I had moved on. In the years that followed, Lucas and I built a life together, one filled with love, trust, and mutual respect. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was all I had ever wanted. Looking back, I can see that the mistakes I made, the pain I caused, and the guilt I carried were all part of the journey that led me to where I am today. It wasn't an easy road, but it was one that ultimately brought me to a place of peace and happiness. Life is messy, complicated, and filled with unexpected twists. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that we always have the power to choose how we move forward. We can let our mistakes define us, or we can learn from them and become something better. And in the end, that's what I chose to do. As I stood there, brush in hand, I let the gentle rhythm of painting calm my mind. The past was behind me now, but it still lingered like a shadow. Some memories never really leave, they just fade, like colors on an old canvas. The lessons I had learned were etched into me, subtle reminders of who I had been and how far I had come. Lucas often sat in the room while I painted, not saying much but keeping me company in the quiet way he had. He understood me, my need for space, for silence, for the moments when I needed to retreat into myself and reflect on everything that had brought me here. I glanced at him now, sitting in the corner of the room with a book in his hands, his presence comforting. He looked up, caught me staring, and smiled. "You're doing that thing again," he teased gently, closing his book and walking over to me. "What thing?" I asked, though I already knew. "That thing where you disappear into your thoughts," he said, standing behind me and wrapping his arms around my waist. "I can see the wheels turning in your head. What's going on in there?" I leaned back into him, enjoying the warmth of his embrace. "Just thinking about everything." "Everything?" he asked softly, his lips brushing my ear. "That sounds heavy." "It's not," I replied, shaking my head. "Not anymore. I'm just grateful, I guess, for this, for you, for getting a second chance." Lucas didn't say anything for a moment, but I could feel him smile against my hair. "You don't have to carry it all by yourself anymore, you know," he said after a while. "We've got each other now." And he was right. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't carrying the weight of my past alone. I had found someone who loved me, flaws and all. Someone who didn't judge me for my mistakes, but who accepted me, scars and all. It was a kind of love I hadn't known before, one built on trust, patience, and forgiveness. Not just for each other, but for ourselves. But that didn't mean it was always easy. The truth is, rebuilding a life after a betrayal, even one of your own making, isn't as simple as starting over. There were still moments when the guilt resurfaced, like a scar that never fully healed. When things with Lucas got serious, there were times when I found myself doubting if I deserved this happiness. Would I make the same mistakes again? Would I hurt him the way I had hurt Andrew? The fear lingered in the background, gnawing at me whenever things got too close, too real. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, Lucas sensed my hesitation. I had been quiet all day, lost in my thoughts, and he finally turned to me, his brow furrowed with concern. "Rachel," he began carefully, "is something wrong? You've seemed distant lately." I sighed, feeling the familiar weight of uncertainty pressing down on me. It's just, sometimes I wonder if I can really do this, if I'm capable of being in a healthy relationship after everything that happened. Lucas's expression softened, and he took my hand in his, squeezing it gently. "You're not the person you were back then," he said softly. "You've grown, you've learned, and you don't have to be perfect. No one expects that. Not me, not anyone." I nodded, but the doubt still lingered. "What if I mess up again?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Lucas turned to face me fully, his eyes searching mine. "Rachel, we all have a past. We've all made mistakes. What matters is that we're working together to build something better. You're not in this alone. We'll figure it out one day at a time." His words soothed the fear gnawing at me, but I knew it was something I would have to work on constantly. The ghosts of my past would always be there, but I couldn't let them define my future. Lucas was right. I wasn't the same person I had been. I had grown, I had changed, and I had learned what really mattered in a relationship: honesty, communication, and trust. The more time I spent with Lucas, the more I realized that this relationship was different from anything I'd experienced before. There were no secrets between us, no lies, no hidden agendas. We communicated openly, even about the hard things, the doubts, the fears, the insecurities. It wasn't always easy, but it was real, and that made all the difference. As my relationship with Lucas deepened, there was one part of my past that still haunted me: Andrew. Even though we had both moved on, he with Claire and I with Lucas, I hadn't found closure. I had never had the chance to apologize properly, to face him and own up to what I had done. I had simply walked away from the wreckage of our marriage, leaving the mess behind me without fully dealing with it. One evening, after months of wrestling with the decision, I finally told Lucas how I felt. "I think I need to talk to Andrew," I said quietly as we sat together in the living room. "I don't know if it's for him or for me, but I feel like I need to apologize. I need to close that chapter." Lucas looked at me thoughtfully, but there was no judgment in his eyes, only understanding. "If that's what you need, then I think you should do it." "But what if it opens old wounds?" I asked, the fear creeping back into my voice. "What if it makes things worse for him?" Lucas reached over, taking my hand in his. "You can't control how he feels, Rachel, but you can take responsibility for your part in what happened. And if you think this will give you some peace, then you should go." I knew he was right. I had been avoiding this conversation for too long, afraid of what it might stir up, but I couldn't keep running from my past. It was time to face it head-on. The next week, I found myself standing outside a coffee shop, waiting for Andrew. I had reached out to him a few days earlier, asking if he would be willing to meet with me. To my surprise, he had agreed, though his response had been short and formal. I had no idea what to expect, but I knew that this conversation was long overdue. When Andrew arrived, I almost didn't recognize him. He looked different, lighter somehow. He smiled politely as he sat down across from me, and for a moment, we just stared at each other, unsure of where to begin. "Thank you for meeting with me," I said softly, breaking the silence. Andrew nodded, his expression neutral. "I was surprised to hear from you, honestly." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened between us." I began. "And I know it's been a long time, but I wanted to apologize. For everything, for the lies, the betrayal. You didn't deserve any of it, and I'm sorry for the way I hurt you." Andrew's gaze softened, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the man I had once loved, the man I had betrayed. He didn't speak right away, and I could see that he was carefully choosing his words. "I appreciate you saying that," he said finally. "It took me a long time to come to terms with what happened, but I've moved on. I'm happy now with Claire, and I've let go of the anger I had toward you." His words were like a weight lifting off my chest. I hadn't realized how much I had been holding on to the guilt until this moment, until I heard him say that he had forgiven me, whether I deserved it or not. "I'm glad," I said quietly. "You deserve to be happy, Andrew. I'm truly sorry for everything." For the first time in years, there was a sense of peace between us. A quiet understanding that, while things hadn't ended the way either of us had wanted, we had both found our way to something better. We weren't the same people we had been back then, and that was okay. After a few more minutes of small talk, Andrew stood up to leave. As he walked away, I felt a sense of closure wash over me. I had done what I needed to do, and now I could finally let go of the past. With that chapter of my life finally closed, I was able to fully embrace my future with Lucas. We grew closer, building a life together that felt solid, real, and full of possibility. There were still challenges, life is never perfect, but we faced them together, with the kind of open communication and trust that I had never had before. Eventually, we moved in together, creating a home that was filled with love, laughter, and the quiet moments of contentment that come with truly knowing and accepting each other. It wasn't a fairy tale, but it was real, and that was enough. As the years passed, I often thought about the journey that had brought me here. The mistakes, the heartbreak, the lessons learned. I had come to understand that life is full of second chances, but it's up to us to recognize them, to take the opportunity to grow and become better. Lucas and I weren't perfect, but we didn't have to be. We were two flawed people who had found something real in each other, and that was all I had ever wanted. In the end, I realized that happiness isn't something that happens to you. It's something you choose, something you work for, something you build piece by piece. And while the road to get there might be messy, it's the journey that shapes you, that teaches you what truly matters. I had made my choices and I had faced the consequences. But I had also found forgiveness, both from others and from myself. And in doing so, I had found the courage to move forward, to build a life filled with love, hope, and the promise of something better. And so life moved forward, not in a straight line, but in a series of twists and turns that led me to a place of peace. A place where the past no longer held me captive, and the future was something I could embrace with open arms. It wasn't the life I had expected, but it was the life I had chosen. And in the end, that made all the difference.